A lonely, elderly man couldn't have imagined how meeting a shivering boy in a winter park would change his life. But behind the simple help lies a terrible secret that no one was ever meant to know. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. The winter chill hung heavy in the air, blanketing everything in a silence broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. In the empty park, snow had piled up high, weighing down the bare branches of trees that stood like sentinels against the leaden gray sky. A rare sight of stillness and beauty, but today it only deepened the feeling of solitude. The path wound through the park, untouched and pristine, marked only occasionally by the footprints of some passerby who had braved the bitter weather. An elderly man, wrapped tightly in a long, worn coat, walked slowly down the path. His breath puffed out in short, frosty clouds as he trudged through the snow, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His name was George, and he had come to the park today, as he often did, seeking a respite from the quiet, empty house that had become his home. It was a large house, filled with memories of family, laughter, and warmth, things that seemed to have faded with each passing year. But now, his children had lives of their own, scattered in far-off cities, busy with their own families. The holidays brought a particular sting, reminding him of what he once had, of the people who had filled the rooms with life. As he walked, his mind drifted back to memories of his late wife, Olga. She had loved winter and would have insisted they come to the park to admire the way snow transformed the world. He could still picture her laughing, her cheeks pink from the cold, the sparkle in her eyes as she reached for his hand to drag him along the paths that twisted through the trees. He missed her terribly, and each visit to the park seemed to bring her memory back to life, if only for a brief moment. Today, as he wandered through the park, he was jarred out of his thoughts by an unexpected sight. A small figure huddled on one of the benches, barely noticeable under the thick layer of snow that coated everything around. George squinted, feeling a pang of worry, and slowly approached. As he drew closer, he realized it was a boy, barely more than a teenager, bundled in a threadbare jacket that looked far too light for the weather. The boy sat hunched, his head bowed, his hands buried deep in his pockets, as though he was trying to disappear into himself, away from the world around him. George hesitated, unsure of what to do. 100 questions ran through his mind. Who was this child? Why was he here, all alone in the biting cold? He felt a flicker of fear. In his long life, George had learned to be cautious, and approaching strangers, even young ones, didn't feel safe. But something about the boy's posture, the way he seemed to tremble despite his attempt to stay still, made George's heart ache with a sense of responsibility. He took a deep breath, pushing down the hesitation, and approached. "Hey there," he called out gently, stopping a few feet away. The boy looked up, his dark eyes wide with surprise and something else, fear. His face was thin, his cheeks hollow, as though he hadn't had a proper meal in days. His skin was cold and pale, contrasting sharply with his dark, unruly curls. "You all right, son?" George asked, his voice softened by the concern he couldn't hide. The boy didn't answer right away. He looked away, his gaze darting around as if searching for a way out, a place to run. George's heart clenched as he recognized the wariness in the boy's eyes. It was the look of someone who had been let down too many times, who had learned not to trust. But George could see that beneath the fear was something else. Exhaustion, hunger, and a flicker of hope he seemed to be struggling to keep down. George didn't push. He simply waited, standing in the cold with his hands still in his pockets, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'm fine," he said, though the tremor in his voice told George otherwise. "You don't look fine," George replied gently, his tone filled with kindness. "You look like you could use a warm place and a hot meal. What do you say?" The boy looked down, his shoulders tensing as though expecting some sort of trick. George could tell he was ready to bolt at any moment, and he took a careful step back, giving the boy some space. "I'm not going to hurt you," George added. "Just thought maybe you'd want to come warm up a bit. My house is not far. Got a fire going and a pot of soup that could use some company." The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet George's. For a brief moment, George could see the struggle in his gaze, the desire to trust fighting against the instinct to run. Finally, the boy gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," George said softly, trying not to smile too wide, fearing it might scare the boy away. He shrugged off his own coat and placed it around the boy's shoulders, surprised by how light and fragile he seemed. The boy clutched the coat tightly, his fingers poking out of his sleeves, blue with cold. "Let's get you home then," George murmured, putting a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder as he guided him down the path toward the edge of the park. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the sound of their steps in the snow. George didn't ask any more questions, sensing the boy needed time. Instead, he allowed himself to reflect on his own thoughts, letting his mind wander to the past, to his own children. How different this encounter felt. The boy's presence stirred something in him, a feeling he hadn't known for years. As they reached his modest house, George opened the door and ushered the boy inside. The warmth enveloped them immediately, a stark contrast to the icy chill outside. The boy hesitated, taking in the cozy interior, the old wooden floors, the small fireplace crackling with flames, the faint smell of fresh bread and spices lingering in the air. George noticed the boy's shoulders relax, just slightly, as though the warmth and hominess of the place were beginning to melt some of his wariness. "Take a seat," George said, gesturing to the armchair near the fire. The boy glanced at him with a cautious look before lowering himself into the chair, his thin frame almost disappearing into its large cushions. George felt a pang as he watched the boy huddle close to the fire, his hands outstretched to soak up the warmth. It was as if he hadn't felt warmth in weeks. "I'll be right back," George murmured, stepping into the kitchen. He poured a bowl of soup, rich and thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, and sliced a piece of bread, spreading a generous layer of butter over it. Returning to the living room, he set the bowl and bread on the table in front of the boy, who looked at it with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "Go on," George urged gently. "It's yours." The boy glanced up at him, his eyes wide, and then quickly lowered his gaze as he reached for the bread. He ate in silence, his movements careful and reserved, as though he feared it might be taken away at any moment. George watched, doing his best not to overwhelm him, though he couldn't help the worry that tugged at his heart. This boy looked as though he had been through something terrible, something that had left him both physically and emotionally bruised. When the boy finally finished, George leaned forward, careful to keep his tone soft. "What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated, glancing down at his hands before replying, "Michael." "Well, Michael," George said, smiling gently, "you're welcome here as long as you need." Michael looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes before he quickly looked away. George could see he was still guarded, wary of kindness, as though he didn't quite believe it was real. As the night wore on, George found himself talking to fill the silence. He told Michael about his life, about Olga, about his children who lived far away. He shared stories of winter holidays spent together, of laughter and warmth, hoping that his words might bring some comfort to the boy. Michael listened, his expression softening, and though he didn't say much, George could sense he was beginning to let down his guard. As he watched Michael drift off to sleep in the armchair, George felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The first night in George's house was unlike anything Michael had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. The warmth of the crackling fire seeped into his bones, chasing away the persistent cold that had been his constant companion. He slept soundly in a room George had prepared for him, an old guest room, simple but cozy, with thick blankets and a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender. The bed was soft and welcoming, a stark contrast to the hard benches and cold floors he had been accustomed to for so long. When morning came, Michael awoke to the sound of soft humming from the kitchen. For a moment, disoriented, he forgot where he was. The unfamiliar warmth, the smell of cooking, it all felt like a strange dream. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he remembered the previous night, the gentle voice of George and the warm meal he had shared. The memory filled him with a sense of security that felt both comforting and terrifying. He slowly made his way to the kitchen, following the smell of eggs and freshly brewed coffee. George was there, humming softly as he prepared breakfast, a sight so ordinary and yet so foreign to Michael. George looked up, noticing him at the doorway, and greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Michael," he said, gesturing to the table where 2 plates were set. "Take a seat. I made us a little something to start the day." Michael hesitated, still unsure of this man's kindness. He felt an urge to run, to escape before the other shoe dropped, but his hunger outweighed his fear, and he slowly made his way to the table, sitting across from George, who continued to hum as he poured them both some juice. For a while, they ate in silence. George watched him with a gentle expression, careful not to ask too much or press too hard. Michael could tell he was trying to make him feel comfortable, but the silence between them held an unspoken question, one that Michael knew would come eventually. When the plates were empty, George leaned back, folding his hands on the table. "Michael," he began gently, "I don't want to pry, but I can see you've been through something. You don't have to tell me everything, but if you'd like to talk, I'm here to listen." Michael's hand tensed around his glass, his gaze fixed on the table. He had hoped to avoid this conversation, but he could feel George's sincerity, his desire to help. A part of him wanted to trust this man, to tell him everything, but another part of him, the part hardened by years of disappointment, warned him to stay silent. Seeing his hesitation, George continued, his voice soft. "I know what it's like to feel alone, to feel like no one's there to listen. And I know I'm just a stranger to you, but maybe I could be something more. Maybe I could be someone you could rely on, even just for a little while." Something in George's words broke down a barrier within Michael, and he felt his guard slipping. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. I used to live in a home," he began, his voice shaken. "Not a real home, just a place with other kids. A place where they keep kids when they have nowhere else to go." George listened intently, his expression compassionate. Michael could see the concern in his eyes, and it made it easier to continue. "It was supposed to be safe there," Michael said, his gaze still fixed on the table. But it wasn't. Not for me. He paused, his hands trembling as he remembered the cold, gray walls of the orphanage, the unfriendly faces of the staff who barely noticed him. And then there were the other children. Older, stronger, crueler. They had tormented him for his dark skin, for his quiet demeanor, for being different in a place where differences weren't tolerated. They used to pick on me. A lot, Michael whispered, his voice tinged with pain. They'd call me names, say things I don't want to repeat. They'd take my food, hide my things, push me around, and the people who were supposed to be in charge, they didn't care. Sometimes I think they even agreed with them. George's expression darkened, his jaw clenching as he listened. He couldn't imagine the kind of cruelty Michael had endured, but he could feel the weight of the boy's pain as though it were his own. Michael continued, his voice filled with bitterness. I tried to ignore it, to keep my head down, but one day it got too much. They did things to me, things I don't want to think about. His voice broke and he fell silent, his body shaking slightly. George reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Michael's. I'm so sorry, Michael, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. No one should have to go through that, especially not a child. Michael looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. No one had ever listened to him like this before, had ever cared enough to see beyond his silence. I couldn't stay there anymore, he whispered. So I ran. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. George sat back, taking in the weight of Michael's story. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect this boy, to shield him from the cruelty he had endured. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a stirring of purpose that reminded him of the days when his own children were young and vulnerable. Michael, George said softly, breaking the silence, you don't have to go back there. Not if you don't want to. Michael looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. But won't they come looking for me? Won't they make me go back? George hesitated, realizing the truth of Michael's words. The authorities would indeed come looking for him if they knew he was missing, but he also knew that he couldn't, in good conscience, send Michael back to a place that had hurt him so deeply. We'll figure something out, George said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. You're safe here. I promise you, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you from going back to that place. A glimmer of hope appeared in Michael's eyes, and he gave a small, tentative nod. George could see that he was still afraid, still uncertain, but the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crumble. Over the next few days, Michael and George settled into an unspoken routine. Michael spent most of his time in the small guest room, reading books that George had kept on the shelf for years, the ones his children used to read. Sometimes he would come into the living room to sit by the fire, staring into the flames as though trying to forget everything he had endured. George, for his part, tried to make the house as comfortable as possible for Michael. He cooked warm meals, encouraged him to join him for breakfast and dinner, and slowly began to share stories of his own life. He told Michael about Olga, about their life together, about his children who now lived far away. He talked about the loneliness he had felt since Olga's passing, about how he had lost a sense of purpose. To his surprise, Michael began to open up more as well. He shared small details about his life before the orphanage, memories of his parents, fragmented and hazy, but filled with warmth. He remembered his mother's laugh, his father's comfort and embrace. As he spoke, George could see that these memories were like precious treasures to Michael, reminders of a life that had been taken from him too soon. One afternoon, George took Michael to meet his neighbor, Lydia. She was a kind-hearted woman, always ready with a smile and a helping hand. She had known George and Olga for years and had always looked out for him, especially after Olga's passing. When George introduced Michael, she welcomed him with open arms, her warmth putting him at ease almost immediately. "George has told me all about you," Lydia said, her eyes twinkling with kindness. "I've got some old clothes from my grandson that might fit you if you'd like. And I'm an excellent baker. You must come over sometime for some cookies." Michael blushed, unused to such kindness, but he managed a small smile. He looked at George, who gave him an encouraging nod and accepted Lydia's offer. Over the next few days, Lydia became a frequent visitor, bringing warm clothes, books, and little treats for Michael. Her kindness touched him deeply, helping him to feel, for the first time in a long time, like he belonged somewhere. But despite the growing sense of safety and belonging, Michael still carried a deep-seated fear that the peace he had found wouldn't last. He often woke in the middle of the night, plagued by nightmares of the orphanage, of the faces that had tormented him. He worried that it was only a matter of time before someone came to take him back, to return him to the life he had tried so desperately to escape. One day, while they were sitting by the fire, George noticed the tension in Michael's posture, the way he kept glancing at the door as though expecting someone to come barging in at any moment. "Michael," George said gently, "you don't have to be afraid. You're safe here, I promise." Michael nodded, but George could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to ease the boy's fears, but he was determined to protect him, to give him a sense of security that had been stolen from him. Yet, as the days passed, George couldn't shake the feeling that their time together might be cut short. He knew the neighbors had noticed Michael's presence, and that sooner or later someone might question why a young boy was staying with an old man who had no family nearby. And he was right. The days passed in a tentative peace, and slowly Michael began to settle into the rhythm of life at George's house. The gnawing hunger that had haunted him for so long was replaced by warm meals, and the cold he had grown accustomed to vanished, thanks to George's old but reliable heating system. He felt safe here, in ways he hadn't felt since his parents had passed. The fear and suspicion that had become second nature to him started to loosen their hold, leaving behind the fragile beginnings of trust. But as Michael grew more comfortable, George's unease grew. He knew their arrangement couldn't last forever, and he had seen the questioning glances from the neighbors whenever he and Michael ventured outside. A few times he had even overheard snippets of conversation as they passed by. Who is that boy? Where did he come from? George could feel the whispers growing, like dark clouds gathering on the horizon. He tried to push his worries aside, telling himself he would handle things if, or rather when, they came to a head. Then, one morning, there was a knock on the door that shattered the delicate calm they had built. George was in the kitchen making breakfast, while Michael was setting the table. They exchanged a glance, both sensing that this wasn't a friendly neighbor dropping by. George moved toward the door, his hand trembling slightly. As he opened it, his heart sank. Two people stood there, their expressions serious and official. One was a woman in a crisp, dark suit with her hair pulled back tightly, while the other was a tall man in a uniform, his face impassive. "Good morning," the woman began, her tone polite but firm. "Are you George Whitaker?" "Yes, that's me." George replied, feeling a chill run down his spine. "We're from social services," she continued. "We received a report that a young boy has been staying here. May we come in?" George felt his heart pound. He glanced over his shoulder where Michael stood frozen, his face pale. He knew there was no point in denying it. The boy was right there, and even if he wanted to hide him, there was no time or way to do so. "Of course," George said, stepping aside and gesturing for them to enter. "Please, come in." The woman and the officer stepped inside, their eyes taking in the cozy interior. Their gaze lingered on Michael, who had backed up a few steps, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. The woman smiled gently, but her eyes remained sharp. "Hello, young man. My name is Miss Callahan, and I'm here to make sure everything is all right. May I ask your name?" Michael glanced at George, who gave him a small nod. Taking a deep breath, he answered in a barely audible voice, "Michael." Miss Callahan's expression softened, but she remained professional. "Michael, I understand you've been staying here with Mr. Whitaker for some time now. Do you have family? Is there someone who might be looking for you?" Michael's jaw tightened, and he looked down, refusing to answer. George stepped forward, his voice filled with quiet strength. "Michael has been staying with me, yes, but as far as I know, he has no family to go back to. He was in an orphanage, but it wasn't a good place. He was mistreated there, and he ran away." Miss Callahan nodded, her gaze shifting between George and Michael. "I understand, Mr. Whitaker, but we have protocols to follow. We need to confirm Michael's situation and ensure he's in a safe environment." George's hands clenched at his sides. He could see where this was going, and his heart ached at the thought of Michael being taken away, returned to the very place he had fled. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Miss Callahan, I understand you have a job to do, but I'm asking you to consider this child's well-being. He's been through enough, and I want to help him. I want to make sure he never has to go back to that place." The social worker's expression softened, but she remained resolute. "Mr. Whitaker, while I appreciate your intentions, you have to understand that we can't simply leave Michael here without proper documentation or a legal guardianship. If you wish to provide care for him, there are channels you would need to go through." George nodded, though a sinking feeling settled in his chest. "What would I need to do to keep him here?" Miss Callahan hesitated, glancing at the officer beside her. "It would involve a formal application to become his legal guardian. There would be background checks, home assessments, and regular monitoring to ensure Michael's safety and well-being. But even with all that, the process is lengthy, and it's not guaranteed." Michael's eyes widened, his face stricken. "No!" he burst out, his voice filled with panic. "I don't want to go back. I want to stay here. Please." Miss Callahan knelt down, meeting Michael's gaze with a sympathetic look. "I understand, Michael, but there are laws in place to protect children. This isn't about punishing you or Mr. Whitaker. We just need to make sure everything is done properly." George felt his frustration build, but he forced himself to remain calm. "How long would this process take? Is there any way Michael can stay with me in the meantime?" Miss Callahan sighed, clearly sensing his desperation. "I'll do my best to expedite the process, but it still may take several months. In the meantime, we'll need to find a temporary placement for Michael." Michael looked at George, his face filled with betrayal. I thought you said I wouldn't have to go back." George's heart shattered at the pain in the boy's eyes. He reached out, putting a comforting hand on Michael's shoulder. "Michael, listen to me. I'm not giving up. I'll do everything I can to make sure you don't go back to that place. But we have to work with the system. We have to do this right, so that no one can ever take you away again." The officer cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "We'll arrange for Michael to be placed in a temporary foster home until the application process is complete. We'll make sure he's safe." Michael's face twisted with fear and anger. "No, I'm not going. I'm not going back to any place like that. I'd rather be on the streets again." George clenched his fists, the helplessness gnawing at him. He turned to Miss Callahan, his voice desperate. "Is there truly no other option? Isn't there any way he can stay here, even just for now?" Miss Callahan looked at him, sympathy in her eyes. "I can make some calls, see if there's a way for Michael to remain with a temporary guardianship under your care while we process the application. It's an unusual request, but given the circumstances, I'll see what I can do." Relief washed over George, but he kept his composure. "Thank you," he murmured, a hint of hope returning to his voice. Miss Callahan nodded. "We'll be in touch soon. In the meantime, Michael will need to stay here until we can confirm an alternative arrangement." After a final exchange, Miss Callahan and the officer left, leaving George and Michael alone in the now painfully quiet house. George could feel the weight of the encounter pressing down on him, and he knew Michael felt it too. The boy's expression was guarded, as if bracing himself for another letdown. "Michael," George began, reaching out a hand, but Michael pulled away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You promised," he whispered, his voice laced with hurt. George's heart ached, knowing he had let the boy down. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I'm not giving up, Michael. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you here." Michael said nothing, but George could see the doubt in his eyes, the walls he had begun to let down now rising up again. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. Michael withdrew, spending most of his time in the guest room, avoiding George's gaze. The older man could feel the boy's distrust growing, and it pained him deeply. He wished he could do more, but he knew they were at the mercy of the system. Then, finally, Miss Callahan called with news that gave George a glimmer of hope. She had arranged a temporary guardianship under strict monitoring, allowing Michael to stay with George while the application for permanent guardianship was processed. George could hardly believe it. He thanked her profusely, his relief palpable. When he broke the news to Michael, the boy's guarded expression softened, and George could see a hint of the trust they had begun to build returning. But he knew that this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead. In the weeks that followed, George threw himself into the process. He filled out endless forms, endured background checks, and prepared the house for inspections. He wanted everything to be perfect, to ensure there was no reason for the authorities to take Michael away. Lydia, his neighbor, came by often, offering her support and even speaking to Miss Callahan to vouch for George's character and dedication. Throughout it all, Michael began to open up again, reassured by George's unwavering commitment. They fell into their familiar routine, with George cooking meals, Michael helping around the house, and Lydia's occasional visits bringing a sense of community and normalcy. But the tension of their first encounter with the system lingered in the background, a constant reminder that their future was still uncertain. George could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and he knew Michael felt it too. Yet they both clung to the hope that, somehow, they could make this arrangement permanent. As they sat by the fire one evening, George glanced at Michael, who was staring into the flames, lost in thought. "Michael," he said softly, breaking the silence, I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. You're not alone anymore." Michael looked at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The following weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, appointments, and inspections. George was determined to secure Michael's guardianship, no matter the hurdles the system threw his way. He spent hours filling out forms, answering background questions, and preparing his home for the assessments. Every time the doorbell rang or he received a phone call, his heart would jump, fearing it might be news that would pull Michael away from him. But each day that Michael stayed felt like a small victory, a step closer to making their arrangement permanent. Michael, though still wary, began to relax bit by bit. He watched George's unwavering dedication with a quiet, guarded hope. The boy was beginning to believe, for the first time in years, that someone might truly care enough to stand by him. But the shadow of the orphanage loomed over him, a dark reminder of what he might be forced to return to if things didn't work out. Despite the progress they'd made, Michael still found it difficult to trust the promise of safety and stability. Too many times, people had let him down. Then, the day of the court hearing finally arrived. George and Michael both dressed in their best clothes, and Lydia, George's longtime friend and neighbor, met them at the courthouse. She had been a constant support through the process, helping George prepare the house for inspections and even speaking with the social workers to vouch for him. As they entered the courtroom, Michael's heart pounded. His hands clenched tightly at his sides. He had never been in a courtroom before, and the formality of it all intimidated him. The judge sat high on the bench, her gaze stern but kind. The social workers were there, along with a few people from the orphanage who had come to argue that Michael should return to their care. Michael felt a surge of fear and anger, remembering the harsh treatment he had endured under their watch. George placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Stay calm, Michael," he whispered. "We're in this together." The hearing began, and the social workers presented their case, explaining why they believed Michael should remain in the foster care system rather than stay with George. They argued that George's age and lack of previous guardianship experience might make him an unsuitable choice. They brought up statistics and protocols, making their case with clinical detachment. Michael could feel his hope fading with every word they said. Then it was George's turn to speak. He stood, his voice steady and resolute as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, "I know I may not be the obvious choice for a young boy like Michael. I'm an old man, and my experience raising children was many years ago. But Michael isn't just some child to me. He's become like family. I may not be young or wealthy, but I have a heart full of love and a home where he's safe and wanted." The judge watched him intently as he spoke, her expression softening. "I know what Michael has been through," George continued, his voice filled with emotion. "He's been mistreated, neglected, and cast aside. He deserves better than that. He deserves a chance to live in a home where he's valued, where he can be a child without fear. I'm asking for the chance to give him that." Michael looked up at George, his eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. He had never heard anyone speak up for him like this, with so much conviction and love. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as a burden or a problem, but as someone worth fighting for. Lydia stepped forward next, speaking as a character witness for George. She described him as a kind, reliable, and compassionate man who had been a beloved member of the community for decades. She spoke of his late wife, Olga, and how the two of them had always opened their home to friends and neighbors, how they had raised their own children with love and care. "George may not be a young man," Lydia said, "but he's got a heart that's more than big enough for this young boy. I have no doubt he'll provide Michael with a loving and safe home." As Lydia spoke, Michael felt a warmth spreading through him. He looked at George and Lydia, two people who, despite everything, had come into his life and given him something he'd long given up on, a sense of belonging. He dared to hope, just a little, that things might finally work out. Then it was Michael's turn to speak. Nervously, he stood and faced the judge, his hands trembling slightly. He swallowed hard, searching for the right words. I don't want to go back," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The place where I was before, it wasn't safe. People there, they didn't care about me. They didn't care about any of us." His voice shook as memories of the orphanage flooded his mind, the faces of the other children who had tormented him, the cold indifference of the staff who had ignored his cries for help. But George, Mr. Whitaker, he corrected himself, glancing at George with a small smile. "He cares. He makes sure I have food, a warm bed, and he listens to me. No one's ever really done that before." The judge nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Michael. You may sit down." As Michael took his seat, the judge looked at the gathered parties, her face calm but unreadable. She glanced through her notes, then looked at George and Michael. Her gaze softened with something that looked like understanding. After a long silence, she began to speak. "This is a difficult decision, one that weighs not only on the requirements of the law, but also on the personal welfare of the child. Michael is in need of stability, care, and a nurturing environment. Mr. Whitaker, though you may lack traditional qualifications, I believe you have shown a strong commitment to Michael's well-being. Your dedication and the support of your community speak to the sincerity of your intentions." Michael held his breath, his heart pounding as he waited for her next words. "Therefore," the judge continued, "it is the court's decision to grant Mr. Whitaker legal guardianship of Michael, pending periodic evaluations to ensure that his needs are being met. I encourage social services to continue offering support and resources as needed." A wave of relief washed over George, his shoulders relaxing as he absorbed the judge's words. Michael's eyes filled with tears, unable to believe what he had just heard. He looked at George, a wide smile breaking across his face, and George smiled back, his own eyes misty with emotion. "Thank you," George whispered to the judge, his voice choked with gratitude. He took Michael's hand in his, squeezing it tightly. "We did it, Michael. We're going home." As they left the courthouse, Lydia embraced them both, her eyes shining with joy. "I knew you two would make it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Now, let's get you both home." The drive back was filled with a warm, comfortable silence. Michael leaned against the car window, watching the familiar streets pass by. But this time they didn't feel like just streets. They felt like part of a neighborhood, part of a home he was finally allowed to call his own. When they arrived at George's house, Lydia joined them for a small celebration. She had brought along a cake, which they enjoyed in the cozy warmth of the living room. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Michael felt a sense of peace and contentment. He was home, and he knew he was safe. In the days that followed, Michael and George settled into a new rhythm. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, and Michael began to open up even more, sharing stories of his past, his dreams, and the things he hoped to do now that he had a stable place to call home. George listened with patience and understanding, offering advice when needed, but always allowing Michael the space to be himself. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Michael looked at George, a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Whitaker," he began, hesitating. "Michael," George replied with a smile. "You don't have to call me that. You can call me George, or, well, if you'd like, you could even call me Grandpa." Michael's eyes widened and a smile broke across his face. "Grandpa," he repeated, testing the word as though it were something fragile and precious. George felt a lump rise in his throat, and he reached out, ruffling Michael's hair. "That's right, kiddo. You're family now." As the months passed, their bond only grew stronger. They celebrated birthdays, holidays, and even the little milestones. Michael's first day at his new school, his first friends, his first time scoring a goal in the neighborhood soccer game. George was there for all of it, cheering him on, offering guidance, and, most importantly, providing the unwavering support Michael had longed for his entire life. And Michael, in turn, brought new life to George's days. He filled the old house with laughter and energy, transforming it from a place of memories into a home once more. Lydia continued to visit often, becoming a beloved friend and honorary grandmother to Michael, who adored her cookies and stories about her own children and grandchildren. One winter evening, nearly a year after the court hearing, Michael and George stood together in the park where they had first met. Snow blanketed the ground, and the trees stood silent and majestic against the twilight sky. Michael looked up at George, his face filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said softly, "for everything." George placed an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "No, thank you, Michael. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Family." They stood there together, watching as snowflakes began to fall, each one a silent testament to the journey they had taken together. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Leave your comments. We want to know what you think. And be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. See you in the next video.